Hello, YouTube, and welcome to another installment of Logos Live, where we discuss analytic philosophy and the way that language intersects with metaphysics. Today, we're going to be discussing the article The Meaning of Meaning by Putnam. Hilary Putnam is a 20th century American philosopher who was very close with Quine and Kripke, two philosophers that came up in our last discussion, um, and who are very central to the history of analytic philosophy. The Meaning of Meaning is perhaps one of the classic papers in kind of the canon of analytic philosophy, because it really gets to the heart of Putnam's ideas about what meaning is. So I'm here with Sense of Frege, and Frege, what in a nutshell, what is Putnam trying to do in this paper?
So I'd say the ultimate goal of what he's trying to do here is explain how. I think the broader picture is explain how reference works. I think is how I'd explain that. In other words, what we mean when we say things, and how that's distinct from referencing something. I'd say is the broad general theme.
Mm-hmm.
So this is the we can get into the twin Earth thing later, but
Yeah, well, Putnam begins the paper kind of with discussing some vocab, if you will.
yeah,
But he makes two distinctions right off the bat. He distinguishes between syntax and meaning.
right,
And he calls syntax kind of the deep structure of linguistic forms, and then says, this is great, and we've really started studying this, but we want to avoid saying that syntax, kind of the way we speak, or these deep structures of our language, actually are what we do when we mean something, when we're trying to refer to something.
right.
And then the second distinction he makes is he says meaning has been traditionally divided into intention and extension.
Right.
So,
So
yeah,
yeah, go ahead.
Intention is kind of like the concept associated with the term, and extension is what that concept seems to refer to. So, I mean, can you unpack that a little?
Sure. So generally speaking, when we're talking about intention, I'm trying to think of how to do this well. Generally speaking, when we talk about intention, it's in the broadest sense, it's sort of a property that's identified by a phrase. So, like for example, when we talk about intentional objects, we're talking about things which are identified by some description of the properties they have. So, whereas when we're talking about extension, we're talking about the ways in which they might superficially be the same. So I'm sorry if I'm not maybe being clear enough, but the distinction here is sort of between. This is related to Kripke's discussion of essential and incidental properties. I would say it's just that Putnam phrases it slightly differently. So I'm going to sort of talk about Kripke first, and then I can relate it to what Putnam says about intention and extension, because I find Kripke's way of understanding it somewhat easier. But basically, the idea is that objects have certain essential properties. That is, things which are essential to the way that object is. If they didn't have those properties, they would be something else. So Kripke's example is you have the parents you have, right? You have to have the parents you have, because if you don't have the parents you have, then you'd just be somebody else, right? You would have been born to a different couple, and then that wouldn't be you anymore. And inessential properties are sort of ways in which you might superficially just are things which are not essential to you, which are not essential to who you are. So the example is if you meet somebody who looks exactly like you but isn't related to you, you have sort of the same inessential properties, but not the same necessary or essential properties. And I think that's sort of related to Putnam's discussion of intension and extension here.
Mm-hmm.
So when he talks about extensional objects, he's talking about a number. I'm really trying to do this without getting to the twin Earth example, but it's hard. But the short answer is there might be any number of things that an extension is true of, whereas when it comes, actually, sorry, I'm butchering this.
Well, maybe an example would help. Like, so the intention of dog might be like barking mammal, right?
Yeah, exactly. But not all barking mammals are dogs, so
Right.
it's not an essential feature of the dog. But yeah, that would be
So whereas the extension of dog, I could point to, hey, this is my dog Rufus. Rufus is a dog. Like in some sense, Rufus is the extension of the term dog. But
that's
all
a
the
good.
all
Go
the
ahead. Sorry.
all the other qualities of Rufus, his fur color, his size, stuff like that, that doesn't carry over into the intention. But just the fact that Rufus is a barking mammal, or however we might want to, whatever we might say is the concept associated with the term dog.
Right.
Yeah.
The distinction is between an embodiment of properties versus sort of. So I'm not even sure I like the idea of the intention of the dog being. I'll tell you why I have some trouble with this. Is I tend to think of extension as the manifestation, or rather if you like, a specific instantiation of intention, if that makes any sense. So
Right.
in other words, you have some with respect to intention, you have sort of a set of necessary features of something which make it that thing.
Mm-hmm.
This is why I was trying to relate it to Kripke's discussion of necessary properties. Intentional, if you say that something is, if there's an intention of something. By the way, this is intention with an S, not with a TI, so it's sort of confusing. We're not saying intention like in terms of I intend to do something. We're saying it INTEN SION. But the point is the intention is, generally speaking, the sort of, another way of phrasing it might be the platonic ideal of something, but that's stretching it a bit.
It kind of works. Like, at least the way I understood it, intention is almost like the definition of the term, right? The concept associated with the term. And extension is kind of like the set of things that definition applies to.
Right. Although I'll tell you, I don't like the phrase definition, because so there could be, just to use your example of dogs, there could be incidental properties of dogs which are not essential properties of dogs. Right. So it, like all dogs, as far as I know, at least all dogs have ears, but that doesn't mean that if something didn't have ears, it wouldn't be a dog.
Right.
And therefore, I would say that when used intentionally, does not necessarily mean something with ears.
Mm-hmm.
Might be an example of that. But yeah. And by the way, some dog without ears would be an extension of the concept of dog. But yeah, the generally speaking, in simple terms, the intention is the is sort of the concept of whatever you're talking about, and the extension is the instantiation of the concept you're talking about. Yeah,
and this is important. I know it feels like we spent a lot of time like on those two words, but it's important because Putnam's argument really is saying that extension might have been at one time considered a part of meaning, but no
Right.
one actually uses the term meaning to refer to the extension of a thing.
Yeah. That's why I said at the beginning I think the main point of this paper is the way in which meaning differs from reference, if
Right.
that makes any sense. So you don't use extension to talk about the meaning of a word. You use extension to reference things. So if you say your dog Rufus, you're referencing that specific extension of the intention. So
Yeah.
um,
So
yeah, go ahead.
Putnam would argue that if someone were to ask you what is the meaning of the word dog, and you were to say, well, Rufus is a dog, and there are 600 other dogs in this neighborhood. Like, you can describe how, like, the set of things that the word dog refers to, and that
Exactly.
doesn't explain the meaning of what dog is.
Yeah, all of that is true.
But Putnam goes even deeper and says even the intention of a word, at least the way we've used the term intention, doesn't seem to be what we mean when we say meaning, or what do certain words mean.
Uh, yeah, that's the rough point. And then the question is, if it's not extension and it's not intention, then what is it?
Right.
And yeah.
So so where he starts off with is kind of saying that traditional philosophers have kind of said that intention is like this mental concept, right?
Yeah.
Um, and then you had Frege and Carnap who come in and say, well, intention can't be a mental concept, because if intention is a mental concept, then meanings become subjective because everyone has different mental concepts. So
And
intention
the
has.
I was just going to say just a brief comment on that. Part of the point, at least of Quine, is that the reason I just want to focus on that because it's a very important point. The reason that meanings cannot be internal is because if you and I are referencing the same thing, I can't know what's in your head.
Right.
And thus the implication of that is that we wouldn't be able to communicate, but we seem to be able to communicate just fine. That's the point. That's it. You can
Right.
finish making your point. I thought that was important. Go ahead.
No, that is important, because what Quine and Frege and Carnap argue is that therefore intention has to be a public property. And I'm not exactly totally sure what they were going for here, but they say like abstract entities, but not mental ones. So it suggests almost something like a Platonic form.
Um, I don't. So I don't necessarily think they would like that language because there's a couple of, so it doesn't have to be a Platonic form. It just has to be something outside of your head. Like Putnam, I don't remember if it's in this paper or if it's I think it's in another paper. Actually, no. I'm trying to remember. I read the paper like a week ago, but I read another Putnam paper a week ago, and I think it was in this one. It's where he's talking about the linguistic division of labor. Was that in this paper?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, that was this paper. So yeah, Putnam seems to think that the meanings of words are not you. They're not determined by you. They're determined by whatever linguistic community you happen to be in, and hopefully we'll get into that later. But that's the general idea.
Yeah, and the thing Putnam says though is that, okay, Quine, Frege, Carnap, you make a good point. Intention can't be private. It has to be this public abstract entity. But that doesn't fix the problem, because if it's an abstract entity, then understanding it is an individual psychological act. So we're still at this point where you've still got kind of the individual psychology of it, which, at that point, it could still be subjective. We would, instead of just having subjective mental concepts, we have subjective ways of understanding this public abstract entity.
Yeah. I don't really have anything to add to that. Just all of that is true.
Okay. So one of the things he asks to kind of make this point, and I know we're ready to get into the twin Earth, and I know everyone's wondering what that is, but this background is important to get to the twin Earth theory. Is he says, look, you can have, Frege pointed out that obviously you can have an intention and an extension. Well, you can have two things that have the same extension, but different intentions. So the classic example is the planet Venus used to be called the morning star and the evening star, apart from the planet Venus. So you can refer to Venus as the morning star, the evening star, and the planet Venus. And those seem to be different ways of conceptualizing the planet Venus, but they all have the same extension.
Right, and I feel this is important. Frege called that a sense. So if you say that the morning star is a sense of Venus, the evening star is another sense of Venus, but they both have the same referent, as it turns out, which is, if you want to phrase it in Putnam's terms, the intention of the words, whereas the extension is the morning star and the evening star. By the way, that's where my name comes from, the Sense of Frege, because I'm not Frege, but I'm referring to Frege.
Yes,
it's silly.
I like that. In case anyone was confused by this, I am not currently, live streaming with the 19th century German philosopher.
No. As it turned out, Frege died in the 30s. Yeah.
And also, I am not, Pope Benedict. My name is also a reference of sorts to Pope Benedict. So,
well, I mean, I also don't think there was a Benedict the 13th. Pretty sure that didn't happen. But not yet. Also, you're not a pope yet. But
I said that's what I said. I'm not the Pope.
Yeah. Actually, wait. There was a Benedict the 13th.
There was
the last. The last Benedict was.
I wasn't going to call you on that.
I was confused for a second. I'm like, wait a minute. The last Benedict was Benedict the 16th. There had to have been a Benedict the 13th. Okay, never mind. The number. Anyway.
Oh, go ahead.
You have something about, we were talking about senses and how they relate to intention and extension, and then you were going to say something and I interrupted for my silly comment. What were you going to say?
Yeah, so Frege pointed out that you can have terms that have different intentions but the same extension. But then
the other way around, you can have different extensions but the same intention.
And that's what Putnam wants to say. Like, hey, this seems possible, and yet with the way we understand intention and extension in kind of the traditional way, it doesn't allow us to. So that's going to be a question that Putnam wants to answer in this paper. Can two terms differ in extension and have the same intention?
Yes, correct. That's an interesting way of phrasing it, but yeah, that seems right. So you have some stuff on here. I'm looking at your notes, and you have stuff about medieval philosophy on here. What's this?
Yeah, so I'm not quite sure because at one point Putnam references traditional philosophers, and he also references medieval philosophers. So it's not clear if those are references to the same group. But so another thing he says is that in the medieval era, intention is a conjunction of predicates. Therefore, intention provides necessary and sufficient condition for an extension. So,
wait, I have to process that. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so it's kind of abstract, but it seems that what he's getting at is if intention is a conjunction of predicates, barking mammal means dog, then, and we know that's not perfect because there are other barking mammals, but,
Yeah.
we're working with medieval taxonomy here. Then if something is a barking mammal, then it is a dog.
Yeah, sure. Assuming there are no other barking mammals, then yes, if something is a barking mammal, it's a dog.
And
Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
No, I wasn't going to say anything. I just dropped something.
So what Putnam points out is, hey, Carnap and all these guys, all the kind of the first philosophers of language, they kind of just adopted this without kind of criticizing it. And I'm not sure if that's true or not, but that's at least Putnam's perspective on them. But he creates this interesting thought experiment. Not the Twin Earth. This is this is the one right before,
right?
And and points out that this creates some problems. So I'll quickly run through the thought experiment. I use the examples of giraffes and rabbits. Those aren't his, but he doesn't give them. He uses variables. So giraffes and rabbits are what I'm going to run with. And so what he wants to point out is that the two assumptions of kind of the traditional view don't work together. The first assumption is that knowing the intention of a term is a psychological state. In other words, the difference between someone who knows what a word means and someone who doesn't know what a word means is, essentially a psychological state. And the second assumption he calls into question is the intent that intention determines extension. So essentially, the definition of a word determines what that word applies to. So the example he gives is, assume A and B are any two terms that have different extensions. So A and B can be giraffes and rabbits. Giraffes obviously refers to giraffes, and rabbits obviously refers to rabbits. If you don't know what a giraffe and a rabbit is, do a quick Google search and come back. But that I'm not going to explain what a giraffe and a rabbit is. That they're different. So by the second assumption that intention determines extension, the fact that these are two different sets of animals, they must differ in intention. In other words, there has to be a different concept or mental state associated with them. So, but then he points out that by assumption one, knowing this mental concept must mean that they are two different psychological states. But how can you be in two different psychological states at the same time? So, in other words, if you know what a giraffe is, you must be in one psychological state. If you know what a rabbit is, you must be in a different psychological state than the state of knowing what a giraffe is. So it seems that we're in a contradiction if you know that the meaning of both the terms giraffes and rabbits.
Yeah, because you have to be in a state. I suppose you could say that I'm trying to think of a way to maybe elaborate on this a bit better. So one way of thinking about it is you can know what a giraffe is and you can know what a rabbit is at the same time. Believe it or not, it's shocking. But if it's a psychological state that you have, how can you know? Like if you look at something, just look at a thing, anything, and you say that is a giraffe and not a rabbit, that seems like you're both checking that something is. Wait, no, sorry. I forget everything I just said. I screwed up. Do you want to say something while I try and figure out a way to fix the thing I just said?
Yeah, sure. I mean,
Yeah.
the basic point is, it seems like most English speakers are aware of both the concept of giraffe and rabbit at the same time. So, and as you were about to say, someone can point to something and say that's a giraffe and it's not a rabbit, or vice versa. That's a rabbit and not a giraffe.
Well, the thing I was about to say, which is wrong, is that you can the reason I don't like the example is because you're thinking of some particular you're thinking of some particular thing. You could just say that it's a giraffe and know that giraffes are not rabbits. So I see why he uses variables. Put it that way. Is when you when you think about this as applied to actual objects, it seems a bit silly. I mean, I'm going to be honest. I think this is one of the least convincing parts of the paper, just because, like, I don't see why you can't be in two psychological states at the same time. Like you wrote it on here that actually, well, Putnam said they have to differ in intention, and they do. And then he says, but you have to be in different psychological states. I'm in different psychological states all the time. Like if somebody cuts me off in traffic, I am simultaneously in the psychological state of being upset at the person who cut me off in traffic, and I don't know, being careful about my driving from that point on. I'm going to be honest. I never understood this. I it's wrong to say I never understood it. I don't find it particularly convincing. Is to say that. Go on. Sorry.
Yeah, I kind of feel the same way, because, and I wrote it on the paper that I'm not exactly sure what it means to say that knowing that the difference between someone knowing the meaning of a certain word and and someone not knowing the meaning of the word is a psychological state. Like in the example you just gave, being angry and being not angry do seem like two different psychological states.
They're contradictory states, I think, is the relevant point. Is that the having giraffe and rabbit in mind do not seem to be, like, you can say of any particular thing it's either a giraffe or it's a rabbit. Well, actually, sorry. You can say of something that is either a giraffe or a rabbit, either this is a giraffe and not a rabbit, or it's a rabbit and not a giraffe. And that doesn't, and you can hold both of those thoughts in your head at the same time. I'm going to be honest. If you look at a lot of, most of the people who cite Putnam's paper do not cite this portion of it, because it's very. This is generally considered to be not the most convincing aspect of the paper. Stuff he gets into later about twin Earth and linguistic division of labor, which we can get into, are more why this paper is known. But I'm nonplussed by this, and I think you agree that it is entirely consistent to say I believe this thing is a giraffe and not a rabbit, and that you can hold both those thoughts in your head at the same time.
Well, Putnam does seem to say that you can do that, but his argument for why you can do that is specifically because the meaning of giraffe and rabbit are not psychological states.
I know, but I'm saying even if they are, my point is, even if they are psychological states, I don't see why you can't be in the state of believing something is a giraffe and not a rabbit.
Yeah, and I don't know if you saw it in my notes, but that was one of my possible replies to his argument. There is, you can say, okay, let's accept that meaning is a psychological state, and let's agree with Putnam that maybe it's the case that knowing the meaning of giraffes and knowing the meaning of rabbits are two different psychological states. But then why can't I say that knowing the meaning of both giraffes and rabbits is a third mental state or psychological state?
Because knowing is not a state, I think, is because the fact that you know something, I think, would just mean that when asked, you can conjure it up. This sort of gets into, This sort of gets into an issue in philosophy of mind, which has to do with what does it mean to have knowledge of something. And in general, I tend to think that what it means to have, and not everybody agrees with this, but I'll just tell you what I tend to think, which is that what it means to have knowledge of something is if you posit a counterfactual where you say, if you could, when asked, give a correct answer, which is justified, then that is what it means to have knowledge of something, right? If you can give a correct and justified answer to some question, if you were asked to do so, that's what it means to know something. Now, importantly, that would mean that knowing is not a psychological state, right? Because if you claim that knowing is a psychological state, it would basically be the equivalent of saying, whenever I'm whenever I'm not thinking about my bank PIN, I don't know it. But then suddenly when I get to the ATM, I know it now. But I didn't know it 5 minutes ago. That tends to be why knowledge can't be a psychological state.
Yeah, and I think that's a pretty good argument. It would be weird to say that because I'm not actively thinking about something, I don't know it.
Right, but with respect to the giraffes and rabbits, it seems to me that I don't know. I guess I can hold. It is possible to hold both concepts in your mind at the same time. Especially if you had a word for it. Like if I don't know. Let's define a word. Something is a girabbit if and only if it is a giraffe and not a rabbit. If it is a rabbit, it is not a girabbit. If it is not a giraffe or a rabbit, it's also not a girabbit. Now, I show you a picture of a giraffe. You can easily think, "Oh, that's a girabbit." It is. I mean,
that
you.
Yeah.
If that makes any sense. But
I think it does. But if I can come quickly to Putnam's defense on this, because I think there is something he's going at here. It seems obvious that rabbits cannot be giraffes, right? However, what exactly is the intention of the terms rabbit and giraffe? Now, we could argue about this because at the end of the day, who knows what the intention of a word is. However, I went to the Greek taxonomical terms of both terms.
Yeah.
And rabbit is long-eared animal that digs burrows, essentially, is the meaning of the Greek term. And a giraffe is a thin-tailed animal resembling both a camel and a leopard.
Okay.
So I could say it is possible that there is a long-eared animal that digs burrows that is also a thin-tailed animal resembling both a camel and a leopard.
Now, right, but his Putnam's point is that's you're sort of hitting on his main point in the paper, which is that's not what anybody means, right? When we say giraffe, we don't just mean I don't even remember what the Greek description was, but we don't mean that,
right?
Because if something came along that looked kind of like a giraffe but wasn't, we would not say, "Oh, that's just another kind of giraffe we discovered." We'd say that's something else, right? If we went to Mars and we found things that look like giraffes but they're blue, we wouldn't say that's a giraffe. We might call it like a Mars giraffe or something. And again, I'm hinting at what we're going to talk about next. But we would not say that new thing we discovered is a giraffe. We say it's something new that looks like a giraffe, which is why neither intention nor extension is what we actually use to refer to things, I think is the broader point.
Yeah, and so I think we built up the suspense enough, and at the same time kind of given the context we need to really get into it. So now we get at really the famous example of how Putnam shows that, look, meaning and knowledge of what a word is not a mental state, because we can posit two people in the exact same mental state, using the same word, but in fact referring to different words. and I'll let you take it away to show how Putnam does this.
Sure. So the thought experiment goes something like this. Basically, imagine there is a planet which looks essentially exactly like Earth. Like, from your perspective, if you landed there, it would be indistinguishable from Earth. You look around, everything looks the same. There's an equivalent of your room and your apartment and your house and, you know, wherever you work and so on. All that sort of thing. And not only that, there's you. And on this Earth, he calls it Twin Earth. And if you were to go to Twin Earth, it would be indistinguishable from regular Earth. However, on Twin Earth, instead of water, they have some other chemical which has all the properties, as far as we can tell, of water. It's a bit like we drink it, we in all the oceans, it comes out of the tap and so on. And he says it has some very long chemical formula, but let's call it XYZ. And the point is, it does not have the chemical structure H2O. So the question is, on Twin Earth, would we say that water is XYZ, or would we say that the stuff on Twin Earth is not water? And Putnam's... Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, and the important thing here is that the people on XYZ, or the people on Twin Earth, use the word water to refer to XYZ, just as we use water to refer to H2O.
Yes, that's an important point. Because the question is, if we went to Twin Earth, the way he phrases it in the paper, I think, is, does water on Twin Earth mean something different than it means on Earth? And I think, at least this was sort of my feeling about it, and I think most people's feeling about it, is yes. Yes, even though something seems to have all the properties of water, we can look closer at it and discover that it is not in fact water, even if it looks like it, and we can drink it. And on Twin Earth, they would call that water, but they would call our water something else. So when Putnam says water is H2O, which he says in the paper, he really does mean something is water if and only if it has the chemical structure H2O. And if it has any other chemical structure, it's not water, even if it looks like it.
And the significance of this argument is that we could imagine Bob 1 on Earth and Bob 2 on Twin Earth, and both Bobs are identical in basically every way. And you could imagine them each going to their tap on their respective Earths and say the phrase, "I'm thirsty, so I'm going to have a glass of water." And right. Bob 1 is using water to refer to H2O, whereas Bob 2 is using water to refer to XYZ. But both of them seem to have the exact same mental state, psychological state, the same mental concept associated with, the word water.
Right.
So this shows that you can have the same intention, but refer to two different things.
Yes, exactly. Sort of the, and that's sort of, by the way, there's a reason that thought experiment is famous, which is just very clever. I mean, it's really hard to think of a counter argument, at least in my experience. Like when I first read this paper, I was an undergraduate, and I tried to think of counter arguments to everything, and I just couldn't think of anything for this. I mean, if you say Bob and Terry are using the word water to refer to different things, but they are in exactly the same psychological state, I mean, good luck saying they're not. I frankly don't see how they're not, because the thing that makes it water is something they can't perceive.
Right.
Which sort of brings me to there is just an element I want to touch on before we go on to the linguistic division of labor.
Yeah.
It's a specific aspect of this paper that I think is really interesting, which is the idea that we can discover hidden truths about things. So in other words, if this thought experiment were taking place in the 17th century, before people had discovered the chemical structure of water, then we wouldn't actually be able to know the difference between H2O and XYZ. Because we didn't know, actually, I don't know about the 17th century. People were starting to figure stuff out. I don't know, the 9th century. If we were in the 9th century, then we wouldn't know what the essential properties of things like water were. We wouldn't know like we didn't know about molecules. We just knew that stuff that looked like that was water. So it's very interesting that you can use terms intentionally, but later discover that the intention, but later discover what the term means. So in other words, for the whole time that we were using water throughout human history, we didn't know what the word meant. Which is a very strange thing to say, but it's true. We didn't know that water actually is H2O, and that anything which is H2O is water. And another way of phrasing this is if there were some other possible world, or some realm of possibility, in which, let's just say I don't want to call it Twin Earth, I want to call it something else, call it like Twin Mars. So if there were a planet called Twin Mars, on which there was H2O, but it had different properties. Like it turns out, for some reason on Twin Mars, whenever you throw stuff into H2O, it dissolves it. It's like a corrosive acid on Twin Mars. Under those circumstances, we would say, we would not say that that H2O is not water on Twin Mars. We would say water has different properties on Twin Mars. And I think that sort of illustrates the a very interesting fact about truths we can discover, and the fact that we can use words even if we don't really know what those words refer to.
It's interesting because we could go even farther. Like we could imagine that sometime in the future we discover some level of chemical or atom farther than what we know now.
Right.
Let's call them
schmatums.
Schmatums, sure.
Yeah.
And we might find out that, in fact, there are two different kinds of H2O on Earth. That some H2O on planet Earth has 3 schmatums, but other H2O has 2 schmatums.
Right.
And this would cause us to say, well, what we wouldn't say is water is one thing that comes with 2 different, either 2 schmatums or 3 schmatums. What we would say is, well, either there are 2 different kinds of water, or we would say that water with 2 schmatums is real water, whereas H2O with 3 schmatums is something else.
Yeah, I tend to think it would be the first one, just because if it turns out that really all the water on Earth has either 1 schmatum or two, whatever it was, 2 schmatums or 3 schmatums, that would, and it's certainly all the stuff we call water, all the stuff that's in the glaciers and the lakes and the tap and so on. If it either has 2 or 3 schmatums, it certainly seems like we can't tell the difference, and so we just call it all water. That would indicate to me that if we discovered that there were some types of water with 2 schmatums and some types of water with 3 schmatums, that we would just say there's different kinds of water, and not necessarily that one of these is really water, just because of how we use the word water right now. But yeah, no, that's a decent example. No, this is actually, this sort of brings him to, I'm trying to remember the exact phrase. He says meanings ain't in the head, which is sort of the famous line from this paper, but I'm trying to remember what he said right before that. Cut the whatever any way you want to slice it, cut the pie anyone, something like that. Meanings just ain't in the head. And I don't know about you. I thought that this is fairly convincing. I mean,
Mhm.
it's sort of hard for you to argue that what we mean by things is purely something that's in our heads, when in fact we can be referring to things.
The only yeah
Yeah, go ahead.
the only way I would be able, like the only way I've thought of that you could kind of argue with this thought experiment is if you were to take like a strict kind of materialist view and say something along the lines of, look, the thing that gives water the properties it has is its chemical formula, H2O. So if you were to find uh, some XYZ would not have the same properties as water.
That's
Um,
what Putnam says. You just articulated Putnam's view. Oh
well,
well. If you were to find, except for the last part, you said if you were to find XYZ, it necessarily would not have the properties of water. Is that what you're
right.
saying?
So
Oh, okay. I understand what you're saying now.
in other words, you could argue that the thought experiment is impossible because you could never have a twin Earth, which I think,
Yeah, go ahead.
which is a decent argument, but it doesn't prove him wrong on his larger point about what meaning is. It would just mean that, hey, conveniently, our sensory experience of the world matches the way we use words, which
But that wouldn't explain how we use words. It would just say that our sensory experience is nicely aligned with the way we use words, but it would describe the way we actually use words. Yeah.
right. So it wouldn't prove him wrong, but it would say that this thought experiment doesn't prove him right.
I don't know that it would say that actually, because they even if you say such a thing is impossible, a lot of thought experiments ask you to imagine impossible things. Like it's like, I know it's physically impossible, but just suppose for a second that there were such a thing as twin Earth, in which it were the case that there was something with a different chemical structure than water, which had all the same surface properties that water has. I don't. There's a difference. So we're sort of hitting up on something here. This is the difference between physical impossibility and metaphysical impossibility. That sounded much more complicated than I wanted to, but basically, physical impossibility is just, do the laws of the universe permit something? And the laws of the universe don't permit all kinds of things.
Right.
Like, I don't know, you can't travel faster than light, as an example. But that doesn't mean it isn't conceptually possible, right? So could you do something without contradiction is sort of what I'm calling metaphysical possibility.
Yeah.
Could something be true without contradicting something else? So it is metaphysically possible for there to be a twin Earth with XYZ, even if it's not physically possible. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, and where I'm coming from is you could imagine someone taking the stance that twin Earth is a metaphysical impossibility.
How is it? How could you take such a position?
I'm
confused.
Well, because on twin Earth you've got XYZ, which has the exact same properties of H2O, but
except its chemical structure.
Someone could take the stance that the chemical structure of a thing defines its properties, and therefore, if you have two different chemical structures, then
okay, but you're still talking about physics. I'm telling you, you're saying the chemical structure of a thing defines its properties. Yes, but things with the same chemical structure, okay, just to give you an example, things with the same chemical structure can look the same to humans. Right. So like there are all kinds of gases, like I'm thinking of a couple noble gases that look the same to humans because they don't look like anything. Right? Oxygen looks the same as xenon to the human. Actually, I don't know about xenon. I don't know what xenon looks like, but just say for the sake of argument, there are numerous colorless gases that we can't see, and they all look the same to us because we can't see them.
Mm-hmm.
So the fact that they have different chemical structures is sort of irrelevant to how we perceive them, which is really what the argument is about, because the argument has to do with how we label things we perceive. And so you could say, well, the chemical structure of the such and such determines whatever properties it has. Well, yeah, but it's simply false as a matter of just physical reality, never mind metaphysical reality, that two things cannot have at least some of the same properties. And so what I'm asking is, just imagine that we lived in a universe in which the chemical structure of something, like for example, you could imagine a universe in which the chemical structure H2O or water had different properties than it has right now. Like, for example, I actually gave you an example earlier in which on twin Mars, H2O has the property of being corrosive. Just take that, except apply it to some possible world in which H2O is corrosive. The main point of this is that we're trying to sort of get out of physical limitations. This is the point of a thought experiment. It's to get out of physical limitations, to isolate a specific example, and just say, sort of, how do we use words to refer to this thing? Like, don't bother me. Oh, well, this is physically impossible. I don't care. That's not the point of what I'm saying. That's sort of a saying, like, and as a result, I tend to think that, like, just saying, oh, the chemical structure determines the properties of the thing, therefore two things which have differing chemical structures cannot have different properties. That's kind of a cop-out, because it's not really answering the point, mm-hmm. which is that, well, okay, but suppose they could, right?
I mean, I guess one of the tough things about actually thinking about thought experiments in kind of this general broad view is that, well, people seem to have different ideas about what is metaphysically possible, right?
I don't think so. No, I sort of just gave you a definition, which is if two things can be the case without contradiction, then it's metaphysically possible. So for example, it is not metaphysically possible to have a square circle, because square contradicts circle. So right. It is metaphysically impossible to have a square circle, but it is metaphysically possible to, I don't know, have a twin, or I don't know. I'm trying to think of other examples, but can you give me an example of something you think might be metaphysically impossible?
So this would be one. Suppose an atheist were to come to you and I'm only using this example because we're both Catholics and it was the first example that hit me.
I'm actually not Catholic, but that's
Oh,
funny.
You're not? I thought you were.
I'm not. No, I'm not. But it's funny you thought that. Go on.
I for some reason I thought I remembered you saying something, but you could imagine it. Well, you could imagine an atheist saying, I know you believe that this universe was caused by a first cause, a first mover, and unmoved mover. But suppose there was a possible universe that wasn't caused by an unmoved mover. And you having read Kripke, you can say, well, hold on, this actually creates a lot of problems with what we mean by possible universe. But at least for the layperson, the layperson seems to believe it's conceptually possible to have a universe without a prime mover, at least the atheist layperson.
So I think that, and you may not like this answer, but here's what I tend to think. You could say that that's the case, but certain other things would have to be the case. So, for example, it would have to be the case that cause and effect in that universe does not operate like it does in this universe. Like, for example, things could spontaneously come into existence, right? So if there's in a universe in which there is no first cause, you have to say then uncaused things can happen. Okay, so uncaused things can happen. So it's metaphysically possible, I guess, that there is a universe in which there is some uncaused thing, right? It's like you could like just the one way of picturing this is just imagine that unicorns in random places started popping into and out of existence for no reason whatsoever. That would be a possible world in which things happen for no reason, in which there is not necessarily a cause. I mean, I don't necessarily think the thought experiment is impossible. I just think certain other things have to be true.
Okay, but this raises the question of what exactly we mean by possible and impossible. Because if I were to say, okay, but then allowing that, wouldn't I be able to say that, well, it could be the case in some universe that the law of non-contradiction doesn't hold in that universe in the same way it does in this universe. So while I agree with you that it's metaphysically impossible in this universe, by the laws of this universe, to say that A cannot be not A at the same time, isn't there a possible universe somewhere where A and not A are the same?
Hang on. So, by the way, the answer to your question is no. But I realized definition of I realized a second ago the definition I was giving was logical possibility, not metaphysical. I was looking for the word and I used the wrong word. It was the logical possibility is where something is true. Something can be true if it doesn't contradict another thing. So something can't be A and not A at the same time.
But what I just did was I basically took your example, which, if you will, was an attack on the metaphysical universality of the principle of sufficient reason, and I simply applied it to the principle of non-contradiction.
So I tend to think that okay, explain this. What does it mean for something to be A and not A at the same time? That's what I mean. I can explain to you what it means for a universe not to abide by the principle of sufficient reason, but I don't think you can explain to me what it means for something to be A and not A at the same time. That's very difficult.
Can you though? Like
no.
you gave no, but I meant, can you, like, you gave the example of unicorns popping in and out of existence. Well, couldn't I say, well, what do you mean by popping in and out of existence?
I mean that there are manifestations of unicorns which exist for a period of, let's say, 3 seconds and then cease to exist.
Okay, I've got to...
At random points throughout the globe. This is what I'm saying, is that we start with non-contradiction because I don't know about you, but I don't know what the heck it means for something to be A and not A at the same time. By the way, the reason, actually, this is an interesting point, and it's related to what we were talking about. I mixed up logical possibility and metaphysical possibility, and they're very related, but I want to explain the difference between them.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Which is, so it is metaphysically necessary that water is H2O because the name water refers to that molecule which is H2O, right? So that's essentially what it means for something to be metaphysically impossible in whatever possible world we have. When I say water, I still mean H2O. And if logical possibility would just be that's metaphysical possibility, right? When we have a name for a physical thing, it refers to that thing in all possible worlds. Therefore, it is metaphysically necessary that water is H2O. Logical possibility would just be if we say water is not H2O. And you say, what the heck is that? Well, it's not strictly contradictory because you're not saying water is and is not H2O. That's so generally speaking, metaphysical possibility is narrower, and logical possibility is literally just if you can say anything and not contradict yourself, that's logically possible. Whereas metaphysical possibility can often refer to the only examples I can think of right now are to do with like names and proper names, and sort of Putnam's example of water is H2O because it refers to H2 in all possible worlds, because that's sort of the canonical example. I can't really think of other examples right now, but metaphysics. Yeah, go ahead.
This is an interesting concept, the difference between logical and metaphysical impossibility, because from my perspective, I understand the distinction between the two, but in a sense, I guess just with my metaphysical worldview, it's almost a distinction without a difference.
How so?
Well, in a sense, although right, you put me on the spot and I can't think of a way to argue against your example right now. I do think there is something about the principle of sufficient reason wherein if you say there is a universe where the principle of sufficient reason doesn't apply, there's got to be some contradiction in there, like hidden in the terms that I just can't extrapolate right now. And I know it's tough because I'm saying this is an intuition of mine, and I can't defend it right now.
No, I understand. But I tend to think that so I'm sort of sympathetic. Just for those of you who don't know, the principle of sufficient reason is just the idea that everything has to have a cause, and I'll tell you, I'm sympathetic to that, and I tend to think it's true. But the fact that the principle of sufficient reason is true, I don't think means that it is logically contradictory to say that it isn't. Right? So I mean, just my own view is that I tend to think the principle of sufficient reason is true. I don't see how it couldn't be true. But that doesn't mean there's a contradiction involved in saying that it isn't. I mean, it's a bit like saying, I don't want to get brigaded on your channel here, but it's a bit like saying the Earth is not flat. Right? I don't even know. There's no contradiction involved in saying the Earth is flat, but like it's not flat. It's sort of it's what you might call a contingent truth. It's contingently the case. And actually, this sort of gets me into. This is a very controversial view of mine. Specifically, it's about God, but this is related, I promise.
Oh, go for it.
And it's specifically about the idea that it's related to the omnipotence paradox. So, like, can God create a rock so heavy he can't lift it? And most people will respond to that with a response to something along the lines of, well, no, because God can't do things which are logically contradictory. And I don't like that answer at all. My answer to the question, can God create a rock so heavy he cannot lift it, is yes. He's omnipotent. And then you say, but then won't he not be omnipotent anymore? Yes, but he hasn't done that, so that's why he's still omnipotent. And
I don't like that at all. You're right.
I know. I told you wouldn't like it, but that's sort of a controversial view I have, and I'll tell you why you don't like it, and why a lot of people don't like it, is because that implies that God's omnipotence is contingent. To which my response is, and your point is, still true. And you say, yes, I actually don't have much of a problem with that, because you could say God's omnipotence is contingent on him not removing his own omnipotence. I'm fine with that. A lot of people are very uncomfortable with that formulation. I've never seen the problem.
I think what makes it uncomfortable is that in traditional metaphysics, God's qualities, insofar as you can say God has qualities, but qualities insofar as omnipotence is a quality, those essentially God doesn't have contingent truths, because if there was anything about God that was contingent, that would introduce the notion of change in God. And if if you introduce change in God, then the idea of the the eternality of God gets kind of screwed up.
I mean, I don't think the fact that God can change himself doesn't mean he does. This is what I'm saying is God can still be eternal, but have the power not to be. But he is. The fact so God can be eternal, but not necessarily eternal. And if he is eternal, I don't see why that's a problem. People tend to want to ascribe like God must be this or must be that. I'm perfectly content with the formulation that God it exists and is currently omnipotent, but has the power to remove his own omnipotence if he so chose. The other way, by the way, the other way to get out of this that I actually prefer is to sort of just discard the concept of omnipotence and just say God is almighty. I much prefer that formulation because it avoids the whole. Basically, all it means is God is more powerful than anything else, and nothing can compete with God in terms of power. That's I'm perfectly happy with that without all of the messiness of saying that God is quote unquote omnipotent. That is, God can do anything, because it leads to. I think it leads to messiness, and the concept almighty I think is much simpler. Although I will say, I'm trying. Who was it? I think it was Anselm. It was
And some of the ontological argument.
It's the same one, but he said something about God's almightiness. So like he thought God's omnipotence consisted of multiple things, one of which was the property of being almighty. It was a very confusing argument, but yeah, it was Anselm with the imperfect version of the ontological argument. There are better versions of the ontological argument. Plantinga has a very convincing version of the ontological argument, but you need a PhD in philosophy to understand it. There's also, by the way, if I want to give a shout out to somebody who you'll like, is do you know Edward Feser by any chance?
Yes, I do.
You do? Okay, yeah. He's somebody who phrases a lot of these arguments in really accessible terms. Anyway, do you want to get back to the Putnam paper? That was sort of an interesting digression.
Well, that's the fun. That's the fun of this. This is, low stress, low key. We're not being graded on this, so I'm glad we had that. But yeah, back to Putnam.
So Putnam, what do we have here?
So we were on Twin Earth.
Yeah, correct.
And so we showed that essentially you can have the same intention and have different extensions. And what this tells us is that meaning is not
meaning ain't in the head.
Yeah, meaning ain't in the head. It's not a psychological state. Meaning seems to exist outside of any one person's cognitive capacity, if you will.
Right. So the next question Putnam is going to answer is, well, wait a minute. If meanings ain't in the head, where are they?
Right.
And the answer to that is, in a sense, the linguistic community. And Putnam is reluctant to say, and in fact he doesn't say, that words mean the things that they're commonly used as. In fact, he says something very different from that. He wants to divide reference of particular words to defer to the experts within a linguistic community. So the example he uses is that he can't tell the difference between an elm tree and a beech tree. Mm-hmm. And he sort of says, like, I can't tell the difference between an elm tree and a beech tree. But does that mean that when I say the word elm, I don't mean something when I say the word elm? And he says, no, I do mean something when I say the word elm, and I can use it sensibly in a sentence. So how can you use it sensibly in a sentence if you can't tell the difference between an elm and a beech? And he says the answer is you defer to the experts in your linguistic community. So in other words, you're in some sense relying on the people who do know the difference between elms and beeches to distinguish for you the difference between elms and beeches. And I think I'm now putting words in Putnam's mouth, but this is what I tend to think he would say, is that if it turned out that everyone who knew the difference between elms and beeches just died, they died in a bus crash on the way to a botany conference or something, then it would be the case, and we sort of just use elm and beech interchangeably. Then it really would be the case from then on. It really would be the case that there is no difference between an elm tree and a beech tree. They're just two. Yeah, no. This is me putting words in his mouth, but that's what I tend to think he would say. Just think of the implications of what Putnam says. If we rely on people within our linguistic community to tell us the meanings of words, or we rely on their knowledge to give our words their meaning, what if they're all dead? Can you refer to dead experts to tell you the meaning of words? I tend to think the answer is no, but
I think
that's debatable.
I'm not sure that he would go that far. I think Putnam would say that at that point, when I say elm, I might not be able to mean a difference between elms and beeches, but that doesn't necessarily mean elms and beeches are the same thing.
But then if you use it in a sentence, right? If you say, like, let's say there's no one alive who knows the difference between an elm and a beech tree, and you point to a beech tree and say, that's an elm tree on my lawn, would you be wrong? Because put it this way, you want to say yes, but the question is, on Putnam's view, how can you say yes? If the meaning of your words is determined by the experts in your linguistic community, and there are no experts, i.e. no one who knows the difference between an elm and a beech, how yeah, go on.
I guess to answer this question, we kind of have to explore the idea of a language community, and especially the role of the experts in the community, because
yeah, sure.
I don't think Putnam is seriously arguing that for language to work, you need to have a specific school or an administration of like board approved experts, and it's like these people who
no.
are
that's not what he means by experts. All he means by experts is just people who are aware of such distinctions. It seems like yeah, go ahead.
Right. So another example, apart from elms and beeches, which works, but the fact that there's so many people who don't know what elms and beeches are, I think makes the example lose its kind of rhetorical force. But
sure,
I know that there is a difference between clementines, tangerines, and there's a third, mandarins. Clementines, tangerines, and mandarins. Like if you were to put the three next to me, I'd be able to say I wouldn't know which one's which, but I would be able to say there's a difference between them, and I'm aware that there's some level of difference between them. So I know that the words aren't totally interchangeable, and yet I have no clue what the difference is. But I know that I can go on Wikipedia and find out the difference for you.
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. Can you defer to encyclopedias? Can you defer to sort of like, let's say all the people who actually knew what the difference between a clementine and a tangerine were dead, but they left behind an encyclopedia for you to read. That's the difference between a clementine and a tangerine. This is actually something I remember we discussed this paper. I took a seminar last year where we talked about this, and the professor brought up this exact point: is if they write stuff down and then die, and there's a difference between them, but you don't know what the difference is, can you defer to the knowledge of the stuff they wrote down and say, aha, that's my expert? an encyclopedia is my expert. And actually, this sort of gets to a slightly more interesting point, which is, look, languages actually do evolve over time, and certain distinctions that used to be made are no longer made. So, like, it's entirely conceivable that one day a tangerine could just refer to any citrusy orange fruit.
And in fact,
And
I looked it up, and in fact, I was mistaken. They aren't three different kinds of fruit, but mandarins are a class of oranges, and tangerines and clementines are both two different kinds of mandarins.
oh, interesting. Okay, but yeah, if you just said any small orange fruit is a tangerine, and then gradually people actually started using the word tangerine to just mean any sort of orange fruit. And then one day, like hundreds of years down the road, somebody cracked open an encyclopedia and discovered that there used to be a distinction between clementines, tangerines, and mandarins. Would there still be a distinction between clementines, tangerines, and mandarins? I think the answer is no, because you live in a different linguistic community from the people who wrote that book, if that makes any sense. You live in a linguistic community in which all small orange fruits are referred to as tangerine. So you mean by tangerine something different than what the book means by tangerine. And this sort of gets into a lot of the ambiguity of ways in which language evolves and so on. Actually, I had a professor who was sort of an old guy, and the phrase "no problem" just grated on him. It made him wince. And he once asked his philosophy of language class if there was a distinction between "no problem" and "you're welcome." And as it turns out, there is, because there are circumstances in which it is proper to say "you're welcome," but not proper to say "no problem." So one example would be if you go to meet the queen, and she, I don't know, and you give her some kind of gift, and she says thank you. You say "no problem"? Of course not. That's a difference in register, but there are other differences, like if I hold the door open for somebody, and then they walk through, and they don't thank me, I can sort of sarcastically say, "You're welcome," but what I can't do is sarcastically say "no problem." That seems weird.
Yeah.
And the point I'm making here is, as language evolves, there are often distinctions that arise, and distinctions that go away. And I'm trying to think of a distinction that's gone away. What's something we used to distinguish between, but
I've been thinking about an example, but I can't think of one.
I've sort of been riffing here on something that we differentiate between two things, whereas previously there was just nothing there before. Like we would just always say "you're welcome," and then gradually people started saying "no problem." But yeah, what's two things that we distinguish between now that we didn't previously distinguish between? Or no, sorry, a distinction that went away over time. So
okay, so it's not a perfect example because
yeah, go ahead. Better than I got.
But I know historically there were lots of you can say that there were lots of different tribes.
Yeah.
And
I know where you're going with this. Yeah.
We don't nowadays. No one distinguishes between like I'm trying to think of the
what are you trying to think of?
I'm trying to think of an example of like two different tribes that used to be completely
the Angles and the Saxons.
Angles and Saxons. I didn't want to use that because
okay.
It's an example where people do seem to distinguish
right,
someone.
Oh, not only that, because there were Saxons who stayed behind in Germany, and then there were Saxons who went to. Yeah, no, you're right. That's a terrible example. Um, what's a good example? I'm trying to think of a better example. I like what's okay. Wait, I have one. Um, what about the distinction between? Uh, no, this is also a bad example. I was going to think of like Italian city-states and how they eventually sort of unified into Italy. But the problem is they're all named after the regions they're in. So I was going to say no one distinguishes between Florentines and Sardinians, but they do. They just don't mean them as nationalities. They mean them as like regions of Italy. But shoot. Okay.
But
Ugh.
that is kind of like I think people kind of get the concept I'm getting at. Like
Yeah.
we used to have different like tribal markers, and even if people today were to somehow find a way of getting like genetically tracing back to figure out what tribe they were, it would be weird to say I'm a member of this tribe as opposed to the other tribe that's also seems to be indistinguishable.
Oh, actually,
Um,
I just the language of tribes made me think of an example. So modern um, Jews are descended from the tribe of Judah, the tribe of Benjamin, and the tribe of Levi. And the tribe of Levi, I think they have like they distinguish from the tribe of Levi for everybody else. But the tribe of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin just intermixed, and now nobody knows who's from Judah and who's from Benjamin. They're just all Jews.
right.
And that's an example. Like that's the first example that came to mind was so yeah is there's no longer a distinction between Judah and the tribe of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin. They're just all one tribe. But that might be one example. I wish I could think of a better one, but that's the only one that's coming to mind at the moment where I can think of like there used to be a distinction, now there's not. They're just all Jews or non-Levites, and yeah, that fair enough. And so in that case, if I said, if we said, are there people from the tribe of Benjamin around today? That's a hard question to answer, isn't it? Because there used to be a distinction, now there isn't. You say it's a bit of an anachronistic question, I suppose. And the answer, I would think, by the way, is no, because the way our language has evolved, we no longer live in the same linguistic community as speakers who would have made that distinction. Do you see what I'm saying?
Right.
Yeah, that's the idea I was sort of trying to drive at. Is we concepts can sort of merge over time, and as a result, getting back to the Putnam paper, which is what we were supposed to be talking about.
Okay, here hold on. I found
Yeah.
I found an example that I like.
Were you just Googling it?
Yes, and
Okay.
it took me a while.
Go on, please.
Scott, the different. No one differentiates. There are no modern day Picts.
Sure.
Picts being the confederation of people that lived in northern Scotland that were not Scottish.
That's a good example, yeah.
So we can, as a historical reference, we can say, yes, there was a difference between the Scottish and the Picts of that era. But
so is anyone today Pictish?
right.
And the answer is I don't know, maybe? Like, if think about it. If all of your, hypothetically, let's say there's some Scottish person in I don't know, Perth or something, who all of his ancestors, like going back some number of generations, are all Picts. Like, if you go back far enough, every single ancestor of this one person is a Pict. And nowadays, that person would say they're Scottish. And then the question is that person Pictish?
Or a better way of saying it is he not Scottish because in fact he is Pictish?
Well, He's not Scottish in the old sense of the word and is Scottish in the new sense of the word.
Right, and I think that's enough to show that, hey, the meaning of the word Scottish has changed. It includes Picts now. If there happen to be any Picts that exist.
Right, but my point is, what linguistic experts do we defer to determine who the Picts are? Getting back to the Putnam paper, do we defer to the people who had actually met the Picts, who were dead for who've been dead for 1,000 years, or do we defer to, I think we would defer to historians, actually, now that I think about it, would be the linguistic experts. But then historians would tend to say the Picts were a historical group. They're not a current group, so therefore there are no Picts, even if all of your ancestors were Picts, which is very odd, but I think that would have to be the answer.
Well, if you want, the actual expert I went to was the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which, by the way, if you want some really fun reading, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle is essentially an English historical book written. I don't know when it was written, but it essentially covers the years from the BC era to like the 12th century.
Oh, okay. That sounds interesting.
Yeah, and it's really fun because it's clearly a very it has all the issues of historical documents of that era. For example, there was an English king that has his genealogy traced back to Noah, or stuff like that.
Funny. Okay.
And then you also get random stuff thrown in there, like 1 year is like this very long, interesting look into the politics of the time, and then the very next year they just say a lot of cows died.
Oh, okay.
The great death of cows or something happened in this year.
That reminds me of that. What is that? That's in Genesis, where Joseph is reading Pharaoh's dreams, and he tells him that there's going to be 1 year where all his cows are going to die.
Yeah,
that's what that reminded me of.
But I brought this up because, in fact, I told you there was a difference between Picts and Scots. But if you were to say, "Oh, what do you mean by Pictish?" I couldn't tell you anything about what a Pict is. I just learned about it basically. What I'm referring to as Picts are the people that I'm told by the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle who lived in Scotland who were not Scots.
So here's the question: are there Picts right now?
Right.
That's my question. Are there Picts right now? Do they exist?
Well, I would clearly need a different linguistic expert, because this linguistic expert, his expertise seems to stop.
Right. And what I'm saying is most historians would tell you, no, there are no Picts today. And by the way, it's sort of funny because the way they generally define it in terms of whether or not ethnic groups are continue to exist is how people describe themselves. And this now gets into a very interesting circle wherein you defer to the experts who defer to the populace, who are supposed to, according to Putnam, defer to the experts, who defer to people. It's very. I'm somewhat uncomfortable with this division of linguistic labor. Particularly when questions of things like nationality, although nationality's always been somewhat difficult to pin down, because
but it does it does get you into interesting places, because, like, for example, it seems like it's a meaningful statement for me to say, well, the Picts lived in England, in the I don't know, 4th century.
Right, and what all you mean by Picts is a dead ethnic group that lived on the island of Britain more than 1,000 years ago and spoke Pictish. But
Right.
it's sort of implicit in the modern definition of what a Pict is that they don't exist, almost. At least the experts would tell you they don't exist.
Well, what I was getting at is that if someone were to ask me, oh, so the Picts lived in Scotland, well, what do you mean by Pict? And my answer is, well, someone who lived in Scotland. It seems like I'm being circular here, but there is some sense in which what I'm saying is not, well, a person who lived in Scotland at this time, is a Pict, and a Pict is someone who lives in Scotland. What I'm saying is, I don't know what a Pict is, but I know that someone else knows what a Pict is.
Right.
And so, whatever that person means by Pict, that's what I'm meaning by Pict.
Okay.
And Kripke gives a similar example where he's like, everyone knows that Richard Feynman is. I'm not even sure I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Feynman. His name is pronounced Feynman.
Richard Feynman is, a scientist, right?
Yeah.
But people seem to have, even if that's the only thing people know about Richard Feynman, it's not therefore trivial to say Richard Feynman was a scientist, because
yeah, that's correct. And actually, you're touching on something in Naming a Necessity that I actually think this isn't related to the Putnam paper for anyone listening. This is a separate issue of Kripke's, who sort of come up a lot. But Kripke seems to be under the impression that if you say Richard Feynman, if you just know that Richard Feynman is a physicist, but you couldn't identify him in any other way, then you know who Richard Feynman is. The problem with that is, again, for Kripke, names refer to whoever they refer to independent of whatever description that thing has. So just to give you people an idea of how we should do a stream about naming a necessity at some point.
Yeah,
I think one of the lectures.
I think we have to, since
we keep bringing it up. It came up last time. It came up this time. It's sort of it's really the foundation for modern philosophy of language. Or we could talk about older stuff maybe some other time, like Russell or Frege. But his whole, just to give you an idea, the short version is Kripke tends to think that proper names refer to something independent of any sort of description that's associated with the thing. So in other words, you don't need a description of something in order to refer to it. You just need the name of the thing. Once you have the name of the thing, then you can competently use it to refer to something. The problem with that is with what you just said, is Kripke seems to think that Richard Feynman, merely by knowing he's a scientist, you say, oh, well, that's a sufficient amount of information to make you a competent user of the name. No, Kripke, your theory said that I can be a competent user of the name independent of any description that I associate with Richard Feynman.
Well,
so
hold.
Yeah, go on. Sorry.
I know where you're going with that, and if you want, we can go there, because that is interesting. But yeah, I just want to say I was bringing it up because I'm essentially saying Putnam and Kripke are coming at it from the same perspective, that in a sense, even if I don't know who Richard Feynman is, or I don't know who the Picts were or what they were, right. I can say something like, well, I know someone else knows, and because I know someone else is aware of this distinction, I sort of can make this distinction as well.
Yeah, that's a rough... Yeah, that's pretty much what Putnam says. You have a note here. I'm just reading through your notes to make sure we get through everything you want to get through. But you say rigidity of indexicality. What? I don't understand what this note is about. If I say H2O is water, then XYZ is not water. What does that have to do? What does that have to do with indexicality?
So the rigidity of indexicality is another concept that ties Putnam and Kripke together. And if someone's wondering why we can't talk about Putnam without bringing up Kripke, the fact is, even in this paper, Putnam references Kripke like several times. Like the two, apart from being friends, were also like
they were colleagues.
They're colleagues. Their theories are kind of built on each other. But so the rigidity of indexicality is basically like once we kind of name something, that is, even if we don't know why that thing is different than other things, we, in a sense, can't use the same word to refer to other things. Or if we do use the same word, we're using it.
Now I understand the note. I was wondering what if I say H2O is water, then XYZ is not water. You're saying once we, I'm trying not to use the word baptize. Once we name water, water is no longer. Well, I don't think water was ever an indexical.
Well, to give you an example, like, sticking with water, it's not that it's necessarily the case that H2O had to be called water, right?
Right.
We could have happened, like the caveman who found the first pool of that clear liquidy thing. He could have called it Luigi, right? And we would continue and, for the centuries, call it Luigi. And there doesn't seem to be any problem with this. We would just say, well, in this thought experiment, H2O is Luigi, not what we call water, they call Luigi.
Yeah.
But the thing is now that we have called H2O water, H2O is water. In other words, I can't, even if I find something that looks like H2O, like XYZ.
Oh, this is the part where, sorry, I just realized what you're talking about. This is the part where he says water is stuff that bears a certain similarity relation to the water around here. Is like where he's talking about the stuff around here that looks like water is whatever looks like the stuff around here, the stuff that's all the lakes or some part. Is that what you're talking about as far as
in a certain sense? Yeah, but I mean, the basic idea is that the indexes, or like the tags, the verbal tags, the names we give things, once they're kind of assigned, in a sense, they're rigid.
Right. Yeah, I see what you're saying.
So H2O is water in every possible world, whether it's called water or not. But that's only because we indexed it as water.
Right. And by the way, it's sort of, this is a point I brought up earlier, but it is important, which is we discovered that water was H2O, which means you could say that water is H2O is metaphysically necessary, but epistemically contingent. So rather, it's not. It's entirely possible we could have never known that water is H2O, but it still would have been H2O. It's necessarily the case that water is H2O, and the reason, just to sort of pick up on something you were saying, the reason that there's a hidden. We should probably explain what indexicals are, because you sort of say water has a hidden indexical component, and that's sort of referencing something Putnam said.
Go for it.
Yeah, an indexical is basically something that is a word that can refer to different things when it's used the same way. So like the word I, or the word you. The word you when used by me, refers to you, Benedict XVII. But when used by you, refers to me. So you would be an example of the word indexical, and that's of an indexical, and that would be an example of something that has different extensions in different contexts, right? So the extension of the word you when used by you is me.
Yeah, that's that's a good example. I forgot that he talked about that in this paper, but he does.
Yeah, and he was going to say, when So with water, there's some difference between the intention and extension of the word of the word water. As he seems to think there's like a hidden indexical component. So like water can mean in one context H2O, and in another context mean watery stuff, depending on sort of what you're referring to, if that makes any sense. So like if you
Sorry, you still there? You still there? If there's anyone in the chat, did he drop out?
I did not drop out. What's going on?
Whoa, you're suddenly all staticky.
Whoa. Okay. Wait, can you hear me now?
Yes, can hear you now.
Okay. Staticky?
I can hear you, but all of a sudden there's a lot of static.
That is, anyway, we're gonna be done soon, right? So.
Yeah, I think I think that's a sign that we might have to stop, just because yeah, unless you can figure it out. Yeah, I think I think that's a sign that we might have to stop.
Let me try unplugging and reconnect, see if that works, but if not.
Yeah, unless you can figure it out.
Give me a sec.
All right, so while we're trying to get him reconnected, where he was going with that is that words like I and you that reference it's actually very hard to, if you will, to define them, because when I use the word I'm referring to myself, obviously, but when someone else uses it, they're referring to themselves. So this creates a problem where if we were to say that the extension of a word is what defines the word, then all of a sudden the word I has completely different extensions depending on who's using it.
By the way, I think I just got this figured out. Can you hear me fine?
I think you're back, yes.
Yeah, okay, cool. I just unplugged it, and plugged it back in. Okay. No static, we're good?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. So that's essentially what an indexical is. And the point he was making is that the word water, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. It was something about the word water having a indexical component, but it lost.
Well, the basic idea is that in a similar way, we can say that the two different, like going back to the Twin Earth example, the two different linguistic communities, it's not that it's necessarily wrong for someone from Twin Earth to say XYZ is water, but we have to recognize that when they're using water and when we're using water, we're in a sense using a different word.
Okay, yeah, got it. That's the indexical component. Sorry. So water, that's where I was going with that. Water means different things in different contexts. So on Twin Earth, in a universe in which Twin Earth exists, and people use water to refer to XYZ. So basically, it would be on Twin Earth, water means that stuff which has the chemical formula XYZ, and on Earth, water means stuff that has the chemical formula H2O. Now, I will say, put it this way, I am unsure about this part of the paper for the following reason. Let's say you go to Twin Earth and you use the word water. I would think that when you're thinking of water, or rather when you're referencing water, you're not referencing XYZ, you're referencing H2O, because that is the substance from which you learned the word water, right? That's sort of the origin of, if you like, the causal name chain of the word water that led you to refer to it as water. And as a result, I'm somewhat skeptical of the indexical component of Putnam's paper, because it seems to me that if you were on Twin Earth and you used the word water, you would actually be referring to H2O, and everyone else would just be talking about XYZ, just that you wouldn't know the difference. I mean, I don't know if you disagree with that, but that was my thinking on that.
Well, it's interesting because you're right. If I went to Twin Earth and I just started talking to people and I said, "Hey, water, water's this, water's that,"
Yeah.
No, like, it's not like I would have a problem communicating with them, but they would be interpreting my use of the word water to refer to chemical XYZ, which on their planet acts like H2O does on our planet. So there seems to be some interesting mix-up in the communication where we're communicating just fine. However, they're interpreting me to refer to something other than what I'm referring to.
Yeah, that's what I tend to think is happening. But I'll tell you that would make Putnam pretty uncomfortable. For the simple reason that he really wants to get out of this notion that I guess it doesn't contradict. I was going to say he wants to get out of the notion that sort of we have this subjective view of the things we say, and the idea of just someone running around Twin Earth saying one thing but meaning something different than everyone else is saying is sort of like Putnam's nightmare. Go on.
The issue you're having there is, in a sense, someone from a different language community is trying to work in a new language community.
That's the other view. It's not Putnam's view, but that's the alternative view, right? Is that the words all when used by people on Earth always refer to H2O. The word water, when used by people from Earth, always refers to H2O, even when they're on Twin Earth. And people from Twin Earth, when they go to Earth, the word water always refers to XYZ. That's the alternative view, and Putnam.
Ooh, I'm not sure. Is that what Putnam means? Because that's
no. Putnam means the opposite. This is what I was going to say. The alternative of his view, the alternative is Putnam's view, which is that when you're on Twin Earth and you say water, you mean XYZ.
Oh, wow. Okay.
No. That's why that's why he said there's an indexical component to water. Is the word water means different things based on context. When you're on Twin Earth and you use the word water, water is XYZ, and when you're on Earth and you use the word water, water is H2O.
Even if you're not aware of, even if you thought that the oceans on Twin Earth were made of H2O.
It depends on where you used it. So if you're using it on Twin Earth, you would be referring to the water on Twin Earth, which would be XYZ. Now, the interesting question, and I'll tell you the sort of challenge to the view that H2O, like water, if you're from Earth, water always means H2O. The challenge to that view is, let's say I know that on Earth, water is H2O, and I know that on Twin Earth, the stuff they call water is XYZ. Suppose I go to Twin Earth and I want to use the word water to refer to XYZ. And I just do. Do I still mean H2O even though I'm not trying to refer to H2O? I'm trying to refer to XYZ and I just use the word water? I tend to think that's why Putnam's view is more consistent, is that if you're on Twin Earth, when you say water, you mean XYZ, and when you're on Earth, when you say water, you mean H2O. Because the alternative would be that just you, even when you're in a different linguistic community and you're using the same word, you can never reference XYZ. except by its chemical formula. That seems weird.
That is weird, yeah. But
so yeah,
hold on. I just thought of an interesting example that's similar to Twin Earth, but it's actually real.
Uh-oh, go on.
Possums.
What?
In the United States, possums are not friendly creatures. They're kind of angry looking things that often end up getting run over or getting rabies and attacking things. No one likes possums. They're generally considered pests. If you go to Australia, however, they have a different kind of possum, if you will. And the possum kind of looks like an overgrown gerbil. It, looks kind of cute. And it doesn't seem to be as ferocious as the American possum.
So I'm going to tell you the problem with your example right now, which is you just said it. Those are different kinds of possum.
Well, they are different kinds of possums. Like, no, but
they have the same intention, but they have different extensions.
Exactly. Well,
so when people in Australia say possums are great and people in America say possums are not great, they have in mind different extensions of the possum, of what we mean by a possum.
Mm-hmm.
That's not quite. I hate to stop your example, but I can tell that where you're going with this is going to be a problem for that reason. Is that they're just different kinds of possum. On the other hand, we wouldn't say that H2O and XYZ are different kinds of water. We would just say that in some contexts this one is water, and in other contexts that one is water. Like on Earth, this is H2O is water, and on Twin Earth, XYZ is water. Because they have both the same intention and the same extension, but they differ in meaning. That's sort of the example we want, which is the reason Putnam had to come up with this contrived example is because it's really hard to think of a circumstance like in ordinary life when that would come up. Like different countries doesn't work because
it's true, you're right. And there are it is very different in the sense that the American possum and the Australian possum because they are so different, like you can just look at them and tell the difference. However, it raises the issue of, kind of the meanings of words being found in linguistic communities. In that, if I as an American start talking about possums, in Australia, we can start with. It raises questions about what's going on when people say, yeah, you're using the word possum wrong because possums aren't ferocious creatures that, give your kids rabies.
You might say that in Australia you would be misusing the word possum. Like, let's just say they call their possums possums, and they call our possums American possums. Then it would be fair to say that in Australia you are misusing the word possum, which would be which would be the correct use of the word possum in America. But we know that. I don't think that's particularly weird. There are all kinds of examples where American usage of there's an American word for something in a different word in another English-speaking country for the same thing. I sort of regard that as analogous to that, and I don't.
Okay, maybe it's more trivial than I thought it was, but
yeah. There's one more thing you have on your notes that I'm kind of confused about. It's the image here. First column.
Ignore that image. That accidentally got put in the notes.
Okay, don't worry.
It was from something else.
Don't worry about it. Okay, got it. Is this a meme? What?
Sort of.
Okay. I won't ask questions. Forget it.
If you're interested, the picture is from my video a couple months back about the introduction to the rules of reaction. But
oh, it's the thumbnail. It's the thumbnail they got in there. Oh, okay. I see. Okay. Anyway,
but
yeah,
but no.
on.
Before we sign off, I guess the big discussion is: do you find it convincing, this idea that, in a sense, what I mean by a word is the language community's use of the word,
so
or the experts in the language community's use of the word?
So the short answer is yes, but I don't like it. The put it this way: if you don't say that there's something, this is sort of called externalism. That, in other words, there's something external to you dictating what words mean. How can you ever say that someone is misusing a word? And the answer is you can, but people do misuse words, right? They think it means one thing when in fact it means something else, and you say, well, what do you mean by in fact? What does it mean to in fact mean something else? And I think that's one of the things Putnam is trying to sort of tackle in this paper, is what do you contrast your view of what a word means with other people's use of language, because we have to remember that language is it's a communal activity. We share language and we exchange words, and as a result, it can't be the case that what we mean by words is solely in the head of one person. Otherwise, we could never communicate. And as a result, there has to be some sort of common basis by which our words do mean something, concretely so. And I think that deferring to the linguistic community is sort of is a very effective way of saying how it's possible to correctly use language, or rather to misuse language, is if it conflicts with the generally accepted standards of the linguistic community, then it's wrong. And as a result, I think that the linguistic division of labor in that sense is a sound way of explaining that, and I don't really know of, to be honest, I don't know of anyone who has a better theory than this as to how it's possible to misuse a word. I think that Putnam's view is pretty sound, which is why this paper is so influential.
Yeah, and I'll be honest, your point right there, that if meaning is in the head, then how can you tell someone that they're misusing a word? I mean, that was a very convincing argument for me right there to accept Putnam. I will say I find it an issue to talk about experts in a linguistic community, because
that's why I said I don't like it. It's somewhat uncomfortable to say that. But we have to remember that all he means by experts is like people who know the difference between two things, right?
Right, but I get
it doesn't have to. Go ahead.
Sorry, but I guess what makes me uncomfortable with that is that, especially with the way language has been weaponized, if you will, in the culture wars. And I know this seems like a jump, but I'm gonna try to put these two pieces together.
Oh boy,
it's very challenging. I think I'm wary about a theory that grants the existence of experts in a language community, because it seems that part of the problem is that we don't have these experts, and words like gay, trans, social justice, political correctness, like these are words that it seems that if anyone was going to be made an expert in this, if we were to refer to anyone as an expert in what these words mean, it creates problems.
Well, then let me ask you this: how do our words get their meaning? If not through experts within a linguistic community.
I've got to say, and I think I'm becoming more and more convinced we have to do naming and necessity next. Because
Okay.
because I think I would actually have to agree with Kripke in some sense here, that there has to be something apart from, in a sense, human testimony, like something apart from the opinions of experts, some way that we can say, well, actually the experts are wrong. And
well, Kripke's concept is origin, so he talks about but his origin concept applies specifically to names. I don't think he ever said that like words can't change their definition over time. I think he's
that's true, but I guess the thing is, I find Kripke's notion of names to cover a lot of what we might call
that might be the case. Are you thinking as it applies to terms like man or woman? Is that what you're thinking of?
Well, right.
Yeah, sure. I can see that. Yeah, I can understand that.
So, if you will, as a Kripkenite, I might oppose a Putnamian, where the Putnamian might say something like, well, once upon a time, man and woman referred to these ways. However, the language community has moved in this direction, and we know this because, Anita Sarkeesian, the language expert, has, showed us that this is the new, the new meaning of these words. And I know that sounds silly, but that is in a sense what Putnam. It's an extreme oversimplification and consequential view of what Putnam's talking about. I as a Kripkenite want to say, no, even if the experts on men and women say that, that trans men are men, I can refer to a continuity of meaning and, a continuity of the way these words were developed, the way they've been passed down. And in some sense, this is not a legitimate development in the term, but is in fact, it would in fact,
Kripke would call it a deviant causal chain.
A deviant causal change. It's a contradiction in the causal change in how it developed.
Yeah. So, how would you feel if I told you that Putnam was a communist, like a literal communist?
Really?
Yeah, he was, like, unironically. I don't know. Are people ironic communists? But no, he was actually I forget the name of the political party he joined, but he was like part of some Marxist political party on campus, and he like lectured on Marxism, and he was actually legitimately a communist. That's not an exaggeration. He wasn't just left wing. He was actually for real a communist. So if you take that into consideration, I think that you may get a bit more wary about his theory of how meaning works, and realize that Kripke, at least as far as I know, is not a communist. In fact, Kripke is almost Putnam is a linguistic communist. I'd say Kripke is a linguistic monarchist in some sense. Kripke thinks that meaning is inherited. It's not given by experts and distributed among the people via some linguistic division of labor. The meaning of words is, according to Kripke, inherited through their privilege. I suppose the nature of how they were born. It's a very anti-communist notion. that's I don't know. Is there linguistic capitalism? I have to think about that. So it's linguistic monarchy, linguistic communism, linguistic capitalism.
Ooh, that's interesting. What would linguistic capitalism be?
Words so we don't defer to experts. We defer to I don't know. I think linguistic capitalism. This is going to sound boring, but I think linguistic capitalism is just pragmatism. It would just basically be whatever the commonly used way of using this word is. That's what it means. Is because that's what the market dictates. The linguistic market dictates, if you like. So in one sense, we have rule by experts. In another, we have rule by popular demand. In the other sense, we have rule by kings.
Yeah, like, well, you could say we have a mixed market of words in the sense that sometimes we use words loosely, if you will, loosely.
Yeah.
You know, where we just use what is most commonly understood. Other times we seem to defer to experts. But, you know, as a Kripkenite, I want to.
Well, in the specific case of names, I think that pretty much everybody at this point agrees that names are when we use names, the meaning of the names is sort of inherited. I don't think that's commonly disputed these days. But so we do live in a mixed market economy. We live in a bizarre mix of communism, capitalism, linguistic capitalism, and linguistic hereditary monarchy. It's crazy.
And in the chat, Clement Down asked, like, prescriptive versus descriptive definition of words, and I think that's at least a related concept.
It's sort of a related concept, yeah. Actually, I tend to think that he said descriptive equals democratic, and I think that with respect to this is sort of complicated because they're related concepts, but they're not quite the same. So linguistic versus prescriptivism versus descriptivism tends to refer to not so much what it's a term used in linguistics, and it tends to refer not so much to what words, or rather how words get their meaning, but rather how we should we should decipher meaning from words. I know that's a really subtle distinction, but I'm trying to think of a way to illustrate that. So,
well, the word literally is great to kind of illustrate. So, like, a strict prescriptivist would say that if someone were to use the word literally when they actually mean figuratively, that they are wrong.
Yeah.
Because literal means literal, not figurative. Whereas a descriptivist, if you want the strict descriptivist view, would say, well, come on, people have already started using literally to mean figuratively. So really, literally does mean figuratively.
Yeah, that would be a good example of descriptivism versus prescriptivism. And I think the difference with like, well, first of all, I don't think Putnam would agree with either of those. Like, Putnam might say, in fact, now that I think about it, Putnam is completely agnostic to prescriptivism versus descriptivism, because Putnam would just say you defer to the experts to determine whatever literally means, and then the only question is, are the experts prescriptivists or descriptivists? He passes the buck to the experts, and then the experts, if they're prescriptivists and they say no, that's not what literally means, then Putnam would say, okay, that's not what literally means. And if the experts are descriptivists and they say literally means whatever people use it as, then Putnam would say, yeah, they're descriptivists. I think with respect to, or rather, Putnam would say that's what literally means. I think with respect to Kripke, I don't think Kripke would say that all words are mean prescriptively one thing. So, like, I think he would be willing to say, for example, that the meaning of a word like chair evolves over time, and that's perfectly fine. Ordinary names, so nouns, basically, as opposed to proper names. So, for example, 200 years ago, we never would have considered a beanbag chair a chair, but now we consider beanbag chairs chairs. And I think Kripke is perfectly willing to sort of make allowances for ordinary words like chair to evolve in meaning over time. I don't think he's not willing and in fact makes a very convincing argument as to why it's not possible for the meaning of names. So specifically, he specifically talks about proper names, like names of people or places and things like that. He doesn't think the meaning of those can evolve over time. He tends to think that's fixed. That the way that names derive their meaning is from the chain of their use. So in other words, there was an initial point of use, and then from that point of use, whatever was meant by that name is passed on through sort of a causal chain of speakers.
And it should. Oh, sorry. Thought you were
go ahead.
It should be noted that Kripke's reference to proper names also includes natural kind terms.
Yes,
so,
that's relevant. So, the examples that one would commonly use would be things like birds,
tigers,
or that too. Yeah, birds or tigers refers to specific classes of animal, and that you can say, well, actually, tiger just refers to any large cat, and Kripke would say, well, you're wrong, because we use the word tiger. When the word tiger was first used, it designated this group of felines and this specific group of felines. And if you use it to refer to anything else, that is an incorrect use of the name. Or rather, actually, he wouldn't say it's an incorrect use of the name. So, for example, if you call your dog a tiger, and you say, my tiger just barked at me, then he would say that you're making a false statement about a tiger. Which would be funny. Like if you're saying, there is a tiger barking. He wouldn't say you're making a true statement about your dog, but you're using the wrong word. He would say you're actually making a false statement about a tiger. Because it is the context of what you're saying in this particular case doesn't change the meaning of the word you're using. Because common use is not relevant. It would just be that people are saying false things. And then with respect to sort of the concept of, if you like, democratic, what was it, capitalism? No decent person considers a beanbag a true chair, says Clement Down. Well, I was going for some kind of, I was trying to, I don't know, what's something we wouldn't have considered a chair previously?
Well, okay, no, that's actually an interesting perspective. Like, let's say no decent person considers a beanbag chair a true chair. So this invites us to consider, okay, well, what do we as a linguistic community here mean by chair?
That's one of those things where, because it's not a name or a natural kind term, there's not a fixed definition of it. I think that's one of those things where, again, I think the meaning of what, like, put it this way, what we meant by, I'm trying to think of what's a word that's evolved in use over time. Like if we used to mean it, use it to mean one thing, but now it means something completely different from the way people what it originally thought. Oh, I just thought of an example. Ship as used in, I don't know, the Revolutionary War versus ship as used in Star Trek. So the question is the Enterprise a ship? And the answer is yes. The Enterprise is a ship. And you say, well, was the HMS Bounty a ship? Yeah, the HMS Bounty was also a ship. And the key distinction here is that our definition of the word ship sort of changed over time, because a ship is not a name, it's not a natural kind term. You can only point to examples of ships, if you like. There's not an intention of a ship. There are only actually no, there is an intention of a ship, but there's not. There are sort of extensions of ships that you can point to and say, yes, that's a ship, that's a ship, that's a ship. And we can't really define what we mean by a ship, but we can sort of relate them to one another. And so I think in that sense, when it comes to sort of loose words like that, when we're being loose with language, Kripke is perfectly willing to say, yeah, that sort of thing can evolve. But specific words.
Okay, watch this. I just thought of something, but
go on.
Based on what you were riffing, and this is actually pretty cool.
Go on.
A laundry basket is not a chair. Seems like a very trivial statement.
Yes.
However, someone, if you were coming,
I know where you're going with this.
If you were coming over to my house, and I had you sit down for some reason, I didn't have a normal chair, if you will. I could say something like, "Hey, sit on that chair over there," or I could even say something like, "That laundry basket is your chair."
Right.
And what I'm doing there is not. What I'm doing there is, in a sense, using the word as a tool, not just to refer to a natural kind there. I'm not actually saying laundry baskets are chairs and meaning a metaphysical statement there. I'm not making a metaphysical statement about chairs or laundry baskets. I'm in a sense telling you, pretend that laundry basket is a chair and treat it as you would a chair.
You're using it in a functional sense. Anything which serves the function of a chair is a chair. Like it is. But this is sort of. I'm going to be honest. When I was an undergrad, I made this argument to a semantics professor, and it drove him crazy. But it was basically, he has this is sort of, if you don't know, this is sort of like if you walk into a semantic class taught by a linguist, and this is the first thing they do on the first day. They say, define a chair, and they just shoot down every definition of chair you could possibly have. And I just came, and I, being a smart aleck, said, anything which I am currently sitting on is a chair. And he said, so if you're sitting on your car, and I said, yes, then the car is a chair. And you say, and if you're sitting on the ground is a chair. Yes, that's correct. And if you're sitting on the stairs are a chair. Yes. I was being a smart aleck, but I think that there are limits to this, but I see what you're getting at, is anything which serves the function of a chair can be referred to as a chair. But yeah,
that's not totally what I'm getting at.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, I'm not. In fact, what I'm saying is that it's not a metaphysical statement. So metaphysically, I could do something where I could agree with Clement and say, well, actually, from a metaphysical perspective, beanbags are not chairs. Beanbag chairs are not a true chair. However, I could at the same time say something along the lines of, pointing at, I could point at a beanbag and tell someone, hey, sit in that chair. And in that sense, the chair sit in that chair kind of gives the game away.
I was going to say, you would never point to a car and say, sit on that chair. You'd say, sit on that car. And as a result, this is my point, where there is a limit for what a chair is. It's just not entirely clear what that limit is. And I think, especially when you get close to the boundaries, it's going to be different for different people. And I don't even think that's a problem. Again, I tend to think that Kripke would agree with the idea that definitions of certain words could evolve over time. But he'd say
another one.
Yeah.
Camp counselor. Kid asks where the bathroom is, and the counselor points to a hole and says, "There's your bathroom."
Yeah.
What the counselor is telling the child is, piss in the hole. He's not trying to make a metaphysical statement about what is and isn't a bathroom.
Right. Use that as your bathroom, I think is what he's saying. But again, there are contexts in which that's not an appropriate statement. Like if a kid walks up to you, camp counselor says, "Where's the bathroom?" and he points up to the sky and says, "There's your bathroom," the kid would be very confused. My point is, there are limits to this sort of thing, right? Because there's a sort of a fuzzy context as to what would constitute a bathroom, what would constitute a chair, and you can't always draw sharp lines around it. Was the point I was making? But you said you were making a point that was different from that, and you gave me another example. But what was the point you were making that was different from the point I was just saying?
Well, the point I was making is that it's not. What I'm not saying is that things are the things they are because of the way we use them. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is that in some sense, there seems to be a certain kind of word that we use in an apparently metaphysical sense, but it is actually almost a verbal sense. Like it acquires its meaning from how it's used. So like we use the terms proper names and natural kinds. Now I'm introducing a third category where, if you will, is artifact terms. I'm going to call them artifact terms. So natural kinds are like tigers. You can't point to something that's not a tiger and say that's a tiger and be correct. That just doesn't work.
Correct.
Similarly, I can't point to a person and I can't point to John and say that's Jimmy and be correct unless for some reason John also is Jimmy, has two different names. I don't know, maybe it's his street name. We can get around to explaining all the ways in which John might be able to be called Jimmy, but let's avoid that. There is some sense in which I can point to a laundry basket and say that's a chair, where I'm not making a metaphysical statement. I'm making I'm making a what would you call it? A prescriptive statement. And I think part of what this is related to is that in some sense laundry basket is an artifact.
An artifact. I'm having trouble what you mean by artifact. What do you mean by artifact?
Created thing. It's not a natural kind.
So are chairs natural kinds?
I don't think so.
Then I'm so if an artifact. So what you're saying is an artifact is anything that's not a natural kind?
Well, artifacts. I know I'm kind of riffing off the top of my head, inventing a new category of words, but I think, the edges might be a little bit blurry here, but chairs would be like kind of a primary example of what's not, what is an artifact. And what a chair is it's an application of an abstract concept onto it. Essentially, it's a creation of it. It's a human creation.
Wait, what is a human creation?
Chairs
are human creations.
Yeah,
so,
from a
yeah, go ahead.
From a metaphysical perspective, I could say chairs don't actually exist. And you could say, well, you could point to a chair, and I'd say, well, we call that a chair, but in fact, that's actually a hunk of wood on which we sit. And you could say, well,
this is a metaphysics. Do you know Peter von Inwagen?
I don't.
He wrote a famous paper about free will. It was called The Defense of Incompatibilism, but he has a similar theory of metaphysics like this, where he used the example of chairs. I guess chairs are just a convenient example in philosophy. Everybody uses chairs. Why not use something else? Sofas. I don't know. But no, anyway, he has a similar theory where he says chairs are molecules arranged chairwise, and similarly, laundry baskets would be laundry molecules arranged laundry basket wise. If that makes any sense. I think that's related to what you're getting at. If you say like chairs are not just like, well, in actuality, that's not a chair. That's just a hunk of wood. I think you would say. Sorry, go on.
See, I wouldn't totally agree with him because, for example, he says laundry baskets are molecules arranged laundry basket wise, whereas chairs are chairs arranged chair wise.
Molecules arranged chair wise.
And this would seem to suggest that a laundry basket could not be a chair. Whereas what I'm saying is a laundry
other things can be laundry baskets.
Right, my point is I can use the word chair to meaningfully refer to laundry baskets.
Within reason, yes.
Well, I guess what I'm actually saying is that when I'm saying that's your chair, pointing... the reason I'm using laundry basket is that you can't see it, but I am actually pointing to a laundry basket as I'm saying this. But sit in that chair, or I don't want to say sit in that chair, but that's your chair. What am I doing? I'm not asking you. I'm not.
You're using the word chair loosely, is what I would say. You have a very loose definition of what a chair is in that specific context.
Okay. Maybe that is.
Maybe I think what you want to say, I suspect, is you're bringing chairs into existence by assigning them to be chairs. Is sort of the impression I get of what you want. That's
sort of, I guess, what I'm getting at. I guess what I'm saying is something along the lines of Hi Frege, I know we both have a common understanding that a chair is a wooden thing with 4 legs and a handcrafted seat. I don't have one of those. So I'm asking you to, for our context here, pretend that laundry basket is, a chair, that wooden thing with 4 legs and, a carved seat, and treat it as you would a chair.
Oh, okay. But how is that distinct from just saying, how is that distinct from using the word chair loosely? I mean, it seems like you're coming up with an elaborate explanation for something that's quite simple.
Well, I mean, maybe that's the answer. I am just using the term chair loosely. But it's interesting that I can use the term chair loosely in a way that I can't really use natural kind terms.
Yeah, sure.
I wouldn't be able to point to a lion and be like, hey, for the purposes of this context right now, that lion is a tiger.
But that's just getting back to what we were talking about earlier with respect to Kripke's views on the difference between proper names and what we might call ordinary names or nouns, is that nouns can sort of change their meaning based on context and natural kind terms can't, or names can't in general. Right? Names always refer to the same thing, whereas ordinary words, ordinary nouns can refer to different things.
But this seems to show that chairs are not natural kinds, right?
Sure. But I thought we knew that. I could be wrong, but that would indicate that chairs are not natural kind terms. Yes, I agree with that.
Yeah, so I kind of forgot how we got onto this digression.
It was some about I was messing around with saying Putnam was a linguistic communist and Kripke was a linguistic monarchist, and we somehow got off there. I was messing around.
Right, and then we got into prescriptive, descriptive, and then from prescriptive, descriptive.
Right, and the bottom line is prescriptive and descriptive are related, but they're not quite the same thing.
Yeah.
Because I think everybody is willing to say that some words can change their meaning over time, and that's not a problem. But then people like Kripke want to say but other words maintain their meaning over time, independent of whatever else happens. Whereas some other people is Putnam. I don't know. Putnam is a cop out from the whole descriptive prescriptive thing. Is whatever the experts say it is.
Mm-hmm.
If the experts are descriptivists, then he's a descriptivist. If the experts are prescriptivists, he's a prescriptivist.
But I guess one of the questions I would have for Putnam would be, okay, how do you know who the experts are? And it's like, well, they're the ones who know the meaning of words. And it's like,
yeah.
But this seems to be a problem because I ask you, like, how do we know the meaning of words? And you're like, ask the experts. And it's like, okay, who are the experts? Well, the ones who know the meaning of words.
So, like, give me an example and I can tell you who the experts are.
Okay. Chair.
And that okay. I
am from Bangladesh. Bangladesh is a country where, for religious reasons, we stand and kneel.
Wait, what?
I'm giving you some color for the example to explain how someone could be asking you for a definition of chair. I say, in Bangladesh, we don't have.
Oh, I see. Okay.
We stand and kneel.
So then I would say the experts are anyone who's not from Bangladesh.
Okay.
Because everyone from Bangladesh uses chairs and knows what they are, and as a result, pretty much anyone from Bangladesh could maybe, if not define what a chair is, could tell you the difference between a chair and a not chair, if you like. Yeah.
Okay. So on a basic level, if we've got someone who doesn't know what a chair is, anyone who has a basic idea of what a chair is is some level of expert. But
that would be my inclination. Well, someone who has a solid understanding of what is a chair and what is not a chair. Yes. So like for example, a baby is not a linguistic expert.
Okay.
A 5-year-old is also probably not a linguistic expert. Maybe when they're 13, then you could say they're a linguistic expert in determining what is a chair and what is not a chair. But
I don't know. 13, I feel like you should have a solid grasp on what is a chair and what is not a chair a little earlier.
Yeah, no, that's why I said I think a 13-year-old, sure, you're an expert on what is a chair and what is not a chair. I agree with that.
Okay.
But yeah, sure, you could ask a let's just say anybody over the age of 13 who's not from Bangladesh is an expert on the definition of a chair. And I guess doesn't, there's all kinds of other qualifications. Doesn't have dementia, isn't in a coma. I mean, that's the point. Is basically any mentally competent person who knows enough about chairs, I guess. Now, it's easier to imagine in terms of like scientific terms. It's like if you say what is a quantum particle, it's pretty easy to imagine who the experts are about that. Right? They'd be physicists. But
and it's tough because I'm sure that some scientists disagree on what a quantum particle is, or at least they have different ideas on implications of quantum particles. But lay people, that's kind of beyond us. That's why I wanted to use an example like chair, because in fact, in fact, in the chat, Clement said, no decent person considers a beanbag chair a true chair. And I mean, suppose I take the opposite view and I say, Clement's a Philistine who doesn't know what a chair is because he does not consider a beanbag chair a chair, whereas I do consider a beanbag chair a chair, and all right-thinking people know that beanbags chairs are chairs.
Obviously,
we're both over 13 from countries that presumably use chairs. So
if I can preempt your question, is your question what if there's disagreement among the experts?
Well, yeah. What if there's disagreement among the experts, or who would Clement and I go to resolve our dispute over whether beanbag chairs are chairs?
Question. I don't have an answer. That's just that Putnam doesn't answer that question, and he never answered that question as far as I know. So yeah, good question. No idea.
I guess the question yeah. I mean, is this a problem for Putnam's theory, or can Putnam...
I think it is, but like in the example he gave between elm and beech trees, it's sort of easy to imagine what an expert is, and somebody knows the difference between an elm and a beech tree. But once you get to more, shall we say, there might be, and I'm just saying this off the top of my head, so it might be wrong. But there might be a difference between experts who can distinguish between things and experts who have to identify something. No, that's crazy, because then you could just never mind. Forget I said that. Also, Clement says he will fight you and he will win. About beanbag chairs. That's what he's talking about. Now. Anyway.
So here's my solution to the problem, because the problem seems to be that Clement and I are both reasonably competent people, and we know what chairs are, but we do have an interesting metaphysical dispute over whether beanbag chairs are chairs.
Right.
And so the way I would resolve this is say, okay, fine, metaphysically, we might have an interesting discussion over whether other kinds of chairs and beanbag chairs belong to the same natural kind. However, the term chair is not a natural kind, and so it's a different metaphysical concept. And so really, beanbag chairs are chairs in the sense that I can point to it and say, hey, that's your chair.
Okay.
I mean, now that I'm thinking about it more, I'm not sure if I'm happy with saying, well, chairs aren't metaphysical objects. They're terms of use, or
so how does this help Putnam? I'm like, does this sort of plug the hole of what if there's disagreement among the experts? Because I thought that's what the premise of this was you said.
I guess the premise is, for where there's disagreement among the experts, Putnam has to have a couple ways out. One is to say, well, one group isn't really an expert, so and I mean that's an easy solution. However, I mean
that's a bit silly, yeah.
more difficult to put into practice, but how are you going to decide who are the true experts? But we leave that aside. The other solution would be to say, if these people are reasonably competent, then they can't be having a metaphysical disagreement over what they're supposed to be experts in. So when Clement and I are arguing over whether a beanbag chair is a chair, we're presumably not arguing over whether you can sit in a beanbag chair. I guess I'm taking almost
Go on.
I guess I'm taking an almost practicalist perspective here, where what I'm saying is, I am calling a beanbag chair a chair because you can sit in it. And you might even say because it was designed for sitting. Sure.
We need a chair alignment chart, like beanbag chairs or what is it, chaotic neutral or something.
Yeah.
Anyway, so but you were saying about chairs.
Yeah, I guess what I'm saying is that I think there is a distinction in natural kind terms and artifact terms, where artifact terms like chairs appear to be metaphysical statements. Like, in the same way, if I were to say this is a chair, this is a tiger, they seem like the same statement, right?
Right.
But when I'm saying this is a tiger, what I'm saying is this is an actual metaphysical object. Whereas when I say this is a chair, at least in some circumstances, I'm not making a metaphysical claim. I'm saying you sit here.
Okay. And how does this relate to Putnam's? Is this about Putnam's linguistic division of labor? Have we changed the subject?
I mean, yeah, I think we got to this point because it's maybe I'm just digging into the example a little too much, but
yeah, I'm trying to think of how this relates to experts, and I'm not seeing it.
Well, I guess the connection I'm making is you can avoid the problem of disagreement among the experts by saying something along the lines of experts can disagree about use. Experts can disagree about artifact terms and how and uses of things, but they don't actually disagree about natural kind terms.
Could they disagree about natural kind terms? I'm trying to think. Like, because no, I guess they can't. I was thinking of cases where evolutionary biologists argue about whether something is a member of some genetic family or something. But like, I don't know, if you find a skeleton and you're saying, was this thing a whale or was it something else? I was thinking some might say it's a whale and some might not, so they disagree about natural kind terms, but they don't disagree about the term. They just disagree about the classification of whatever bones they just found. They still agree on the natural kind term itself. They just don't agree on whether that thing should be classed under that term. So, yeah, no, I think that's fair. And I do have to go soon because I have to wake up early tomorrow. But
yeah, I know we definitely got lost in some of the examples, but I think we gave I think that was a pretty good discussion of the pros and cons of Putnam's linguistic community and the role of experts. Like,
yeah, I think so.
You solve a lot of problems with where if you're trying to find objective meaning in the head, you get lost in it. And Putnam kind of resolves this by saying it's actually a communal exercise and the role of experts is important. But then you get into the problems we were just having, which is, well, how do you know who's an expert and
who isn't?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's not entirely clear.
So thanks for coming on, Frege, and to everyone watching, thanks for staying with us. Glad you were here, and make sure you check out Sense of Frege's YouTube channel.
I'll post when I'm not busy, but yeah, I've just been so busy I haven't posted anything yet. But you'll see when I post a video. Anyway, yeah, it's been great.
All right, have a good one, guys. Go with God.